Let me begin with an uncomfortable question. How do you know when you actually understand something? Most people answer without thinking. They say, I understand it when I can explain it, or when I've studied it enough, or when I can answer the questions at the end of the chapter. Those answers sound reasonable, but they hide a deeper problem. Very often what we call understanding is only familiarity. We've heard the words so many times that they no longer sound strange, and we mistake that comfort for knowledge. This illusion is powerful. It feels exactly like understanding from the inside. Think back to sitting in a classroom, listening to a lecture. The teacher writes neatly on the chalkboard. The steps follow one another smoothly. You nod along. Everything seems clear. But then, later that evening, you sit alone with a blank sheet of paper and try to explain the idea to yourself. Suddenly, the clarity evaporates. You remember the words, but not why they are true. Something that felt solid now feels slippery. Nothing has gone wrong. You've simply discovered the difference between recognition and understanding. Recognition is easy. When you see an explanation again, your mind says, ah, yes, I've seen that before. Understanding is harder. It means you could have produced the explanation yourself, even if nobody had shown it to you in quite that way. Here's a simple test. Pick any subject you believe you know well. Something you've studied, something you're confident about. Now imagine explaining it to a curious person who has no background at all, not a colleague, not a fellow student, someone intelligent but unfamiliar. You are not allowed to use technical terms unless you first explain them. Most people discover an awkward silence at this point. They start confidently, then slow down. Sentences trail off. The explanation begins to lean heavily on phrases like, it just works that way, or that's what it's called. These are warning signs. They tell you that the explanation has reached a place where understanding was assumed rather than built. This is not something to be embarrassed about. It happens to everyone, including professionals. In fact, it happens most often to people who have spent years around a subject. Familiarity grows quietly, and with it grows the danger of mistaking vocabulary for insight. Words are useful tools, but they can also be disguises. A good technical term compresses a long explanation into a short label. That's convenient once you understand the explanation. But if you learn the label first and never unpack it, the word becomes a substitute for thought. You can see this clearly with children. Ask a child why the sky is blue. If they answer because of light scattering, they haven't explained anything at all. They've simply traded a question for a phrase. An honest answer might sound clumsier. Sunlight goes through the air, and the air bumps the light around in a way that spreads the blue more than the other colors. That answer isn't perfect, but it's trying to connect the words to the world. The illusion of understanding survives because it is rarely tested. In school, you are often asked to repeat definitions, solve familiar problems, or follow known steps. These tasks reward recognition, not reconstruction. You can succeed while never asking yourself whether you truly know what is going on. But real understanding reveals itself only under pressure, when you must explain, adapt, or reason without a script. Imagine you're standing at a chalkboard with no notes. Someone asks you a simple why question. There's no time to look anything up. You must rely on your own picture of how things fit together. In that moment, there is nowhere for empty words to hide. That moment can feel uncomfortable, even threatening. The mind prefers certainty. It prefers to feel competent. So it clings to polished phrases and avoids probing too deeply. But learning demands the opposite attitude. It requires a willingness to expose what you don't yet know. This is the first and perhaps most important habit of real learning, intellectual honesty with yourself. When you notice that you don't understand something as well as you thought, resist the urge to patch it over with memorization. Instead, pause. Ask yourself exactly where the explanation becomes foggy. Is it a missing step, an unclear cause, an assumption you never examined? The gap itself is valuable. It tells you precisely where your thinking needs work. Understanding does not arrive all at once. It grows in layers. First comes a rough picture, then refinement, then occasional corrections when you realize that an earlier idea was only partly right. Each layer replaces vagueness with structure, and the process never truly ends. Even experts, when they are honest, will tell you that their understanding is full of approximations. They know which parts are solid and which are still mysterious. That awareness is not a weakness. It's a strength. So if you take nothing else from this chapter, take this. Feeling certain is not the same as understanding. Comfort is not proof. Fluency with words is not clarity of thought. The moment you catch yourself saying, "I know this," is the perfect moment to ask, "Do I really?" That question, asked sincerely, is where learning actually begins. Memorization has an honest appeal. It gives you something firm to hold on to. You can point to a page, a list, a formula, and say, "I know this." There is a quiet comfort in that certainty, especially when learning feels overwhelming. But that comfort can be misleading, because memorization often imitates learning without becoming it. To see why, consider what happens when you memorize a telephone number. You can repeat it accurately, perhaps even quickly. But if someone asks why the number is arranged the way it is, the question makes no sense. There is nothing to understand, only something to recall. Memorization works perfectly for such tasks. Now consider a different kind of knowledge, how a train moves down the track. You could memorize the names of every part of the locomotive, learn where each valve and lever sits, and even draw a beautiful diagram from memory. Yet if you are asked why opening the throttle makes the train move faster, or what would happen if the steam pressure dropped suddenly, those memorized facts may sit uselessly in your mind, like tools locked in a box without a key. The difference is that understanding requires connections. Memorization stores isolated pieces. Understanding weaves them to get her. This is why memorization often feels productive at first. Each new fact feels like progress. Your notebook fills. Your recall improves. You begin to recognize problems and examples quickly. Recognition is satisfying. It produces a sense of fluency, and fluency is easily mistaken for mastery. But fluency has a weakness. It depends on familiarity. Change the problem slightly, remove a familiar cue, or ask a question in an unfamiliar way, and the sense of understanding collapses. Imagine a student who has memorized the steps for solving a particular kind of problem. When the problem appears in the same form, the solution flows smoothly. But when one small detail changes, a number, a condition, a wording, the student freezes, the steps no longer apply, and without understanding the reasons behind them, there is nowhere to turn. This reveals the central flaw of memorization. As a learning strategy, it prepares you for repetition, not for thinking. Understanding, by contrast, is flexible. When you understand an idea, you can approach it from different angles. You can explain it in new words. You can adapt it when conditions change. You can even derive forgotten details by reasoning them out again. This is why someone who truly understands can forget a formula and still solve the problem, while someone who memorized the formula is helpless without it. Let's return to the train. Suppose you forget the exact arrangement of pipes inside the engine. If you understand that heat C causes water to expand into steam, that steam pushes against pistons, and those pistons turn wheels through a series of mechanical connections, you can reconstruct the story. You may not get every detail right, but you know the logic of the machine. That logic guides you. Memorization alone gives no such guidance. Another reason memorization feels like learning is that it is easy to measure. You can test it quickly. You can count correct answers. Understanding is harder to measure because it lives in explanations, not check marks. This creates a dangerous habit. Learners begin to aim for what can be tested rather than what can be understood. They study to remember, not to reason. Over time, they may even forget that reasoning was the goal in the first place. But here's the most subtle danger. Memorization can prevent understanding by giving the illusion that the work is already done. Once something is memorized, the mind tends to stop asking questions. The words feel complete. The topic feels closed. Curiosity moves on, even though the foundation is shaky. A better approach is to treat memorized facts as raw materials, not finished structures. Facts are useful, names are useful, definitions are useful, but they are starting points, not destinations. Each one should provoke a question: how does this connect to what I already know? What does it describe in the real world? What would happen if it were different? Try a simple exercise. Take a definition you have memorized and move the key word. Replace it with a description instead. If the definition collapses, it means the word was doing all the work. For example, instead of saying, "energy is the capacity to do work," Ask yourself what that actually means in practice. What kind of work? How do you see it happen? Where does the energy go afterward? These questions force you out of memorization and into reasoning. Understanding also has a distinctive feeling. It is quieter than memorization. There is less certainty, but more confidence. You may not know every detail, but you know how the pieces fit together. You know where to look if something goes wrong. And perhaps most importantly, understanding survives forgetting. You will forget facts. Everyone does. But if you have built a structure of ideas, if you understand the reasons behind the facts, you can rebuild what you've lost. Learning becomes something you can recover, not something that disappears the moment a detail slips your mind. So memorization is not the enemy. It is simply insufficient. Learn the facts, yes, but don't stop there. Use them, question them, try to explain them, break them and rebuild them, because the goal of learning is not to carry information. It is to be able to think when information is missing. There is a simple way to discover whether you understand something, and it requires no examinations, no grades, and no authority figures. You only need an imaginary student. This student is intelligent, patient, and relentlessly curious. They are not impressed by fancy language. They are not in a hurry, and they interrupt you often. You might think the student sounds annoying, and they are, but they are also the best teacher you will ever have. Suppose you sit down with a sheet of paper and decide to explain an idea you're trying to learn. You begin confidently enough. The first few sentences come easily. You recognize the territory. But then the invisible student raises a hand and asks a question so simple it feels unfair. Why does that happen? At this point, something important occurs. You are forced to slow down. You can no longer lean on momentum or memory. You must either explain the reason or admit that you don't know it. This moment is the heart of learning. When you explain to yourself silently, it is easy to skip steps without noticing. The mind glides over gaps, filling them with the comforting feeling of familiarity. But when you explain out loud, even to no one, the gaps become audible. They show up as hesitations, awkward phrasing, and sudden dependence on unexplained terms. This is not a weakness of the method. It is its strength. Imagine you are standing at a chalkboard in an empty classroom. You draw a simple diagram, you point to it, you speak as if someone were listening. The act of explaining forces you to arrange your thoughts in a logical order. Causes must come before effects. Assumptions must be stated. Words must refer to something concrete. Very quickly, why you discover where your thinking becomes cloudy. Perhaps you find yourself saying, and then it just happens, or that's what makes it work. These phrases are alarms. They tell you that the explanation has reached a place where you were relying on trust rather than understanding. The invisible student does not let this pass. They ask, what do you mean by just happens? They ask, why does that make it work? They ask, could it work some other way? Each question peels back another layer. This process can feel slow. It can feel frustrating, but it is far more efficient than vague studying because it directs your attention precisely where it is needed. Instead of rereading entire chapters, you focus on the single step that doesn't yet make sense. Over time, you begin to notice a change. Your explanations become shorter, clearer, and more natural. You rely less on technical terms and more on relationships and pictures. You stop memorizing sequences and start telling stories. Stories are powerful because they reflect how understanding actually works. When you understand something, you don't store it as a list. You store it as a chain of reasons. This leads to that, which causes this, which results in that. Consider explaining why the seasons change. A memorized explanation might mention the tilt of the Earth's axis. A real explanation builds a picture, a spinning sphere leaning slightly as it travels around the sun, causing different parts to receive more or less light at different times of year. The picture answers many questions at once, including ones you haven't been asked yet. The invisible student rewards pictures. Another benefit of this method is that it exposes hidden assumptions. Many explanations rely on ideas that are never stated because they seem obvious. But obvious to whom? Often they are obvious only because you have accepted them without examination. When you explain to someone with no background, those assumptions surface. You realize you've been standing on an idea you never checked. Sometimes that idea is solid, sometimes it isn't. This is how understanding deepens, not by adding more information, but by strengthening the foundations. It is also worth noticing that explaining does not require perfection. You are not writing a textbook. You are exploring your own thinking. If your explanation is clumsy, that's fine. If it changes halfway through, that's a sign of progress. In fact, explanations that evolve as you speak are often the most honest ones. They show the mind actively working, adjusting, and refining. There is a temptation to wait until you understand something fully before trying to explain it. That temptation should be resisted. Explanation is not the reward for understanding, it is the path to it. Begin early, explain poorly. Notice where it breaks, repair it, explain again, and do not be afraid to say, "I don't know yet." That sentence, spoken honestly, clears away pretense and opens space for real learning. The invisible student is patient. They are not impressed by speed or polish. They care only that each step makes sense. If you learn to satisfy that student, you will find that examinations become easier, conversations become clearer, and your confidence becomes quieter and more durable. Because you are no longer relying on memory or authority, you are relying on understanding. Confusion has a bad reputation. Most people treat it as a warning sign, something to avoid or conceal. In classrooms, confusion is often met with embarrassment. In private study, it feels like failure. But this attitude misunderstands what confusion really is. Confusion is not the absence of learning, it is evidence that learning is underway. When you encounter a new idea, your mind tries to fit it into what it already knows. Sometimes it fits easily. Often it doesn't. Pieces clash. Explanations seem incomplete. Questions multiply. That uncomfortable state where nothing quite settles is confusion, and it is exactly where understanding begins to form. Think about learning to navigate a new city. At first, every street feels disconnected. You recognize landmarks, but don't yet see how they relate. You take wrong turns, you hesitate. Over time, the city begins to organize itself in your mind. Routes appear, distances make sense. What once felt chaotic becomes familiar. Confusion is the early map-making stage. The mistake many learners make is trying to escape confusion as quickly as possible. They rush to memorized answers, neat summaries, or authoritative explanations that promise certainty. These may relieve discomfort, but they often short-circuit understanding. The mind accepts the answer before it has had time to build the structure that gives the answer meaning. There is a subtle difference between being confused and being lost. Being lost means you have no direction. Confusion means you are surrounded by possibilities and haven't yet sorted them out. The difference is important. A confused mind is active. It is testing ideas, comparing explanations, noticing contradictions. A lost mind has stopped engaging. The goal is not to eliminate confusion, but to work within it. One way to do this is to be precise about what you don't understand. Vague confusion is paralyzing. Specific confusion is productive. Instead of saying, "I don't get this," try to say, "I don't understand why this step follows from the previous one." Or, "I can't see how this cause leads to that effect." The moment confusion becomes specific, it becomes a question, and questions can be investigated. This requires patience. It also requires humility. There is a temptation, especially among intelligent learners, to hide confusion, even from themselves. They nod along, they move on, they assume clarity will arrive later. Sometimes it does, often it doesn't. The confusion hardens into a weak spot that limits everything built on top of it. Intellectual honesty means being willing to stop and say, "This doesn't make sense to me yet." The word "yet" matters. Uncertainty plays a similar role. Many people believe that understanding means certainty, that knowledge should feel firm and final. But real understanding often comes with an awareness of limits. You know what works, where it works, and where it stops working. Consider something as simple as explaining why objects fall. You can describe how they fall, predict how fast they fall, and measure it with great precision. But if you ask why gravity exists at all, you reach a boundary. Beyond that boundary, the explanations become incomplete. This does not make the understanding useless. It makes it honest. The most dangerous kind of ignorance is the kind that doesn't know its own limits. A person who believes they are completely certain is unlikely to notice when they are wrong. A person who knows where their understanding fades is prepared to learn more. Uncertainty, when acknowledged, sharpens thinking. It encourages careful language. Instead of saying, "This is how it is," you say, "This is how it appears to work under these conditions." That small shift keeps the mind open. It leaves room for refinement and correction. This is especially important when learning from books or teachers. No explanation is perfect. Every model simplifies. Every diagram leaves something out. Understanding grows not by accepting these simplifications blindly, but by knowing what they include and what they ignore. A learner who is comfortable with uncertainty asks better questions. They are not trying to defend their knowledge. They are trying to test it. There is also an emotional aspect to confusion and uncertainty. They can be uncomfortable because they threaten our sense of competence. But competence built on fragile certainty is easily shaken. Competence built on honest understanding is resilient. If you allow yourself to be confused openly and deliberately, you develop confidence of a different kind, not the confidence of having all the answers, but the confidence of knowing how to look for them. This kind of confidence does not rush. It does not panic when faced with a new idea. It expects confusion. It welcomes it as part of the process. Over time, something interesting happens. You begin to recognize the shape of confusion. You can tell when you are close to understanding because the confusion becomes sharper, more focused. The fog thins, questions become precise. That is often the moment just before clarity arrives. And when clarity does arrive, it is not dramatic. It is quiet. It feels like things clicking into place. You don't just know the answer. You see why it had to be that way. So do not fear confusion. Do not hide from uncertainty. They are not obstacles on the path to learning. They are the path. By now, it should be clear that learning is not a matter of collecting information. It is a way of thinking, a habit of mind that shapes how you approach new ideas, questions and problems. Once you see learning this way, it stops being something you do only in classrooms or books. It becomes something you carry with you. Most people imagine learning as a temporary activity. You study, you finish, you move on. But real understanding does not arrive fully formed, nor does it ever truly end. It grows, adjusts, and sometimes corrects itself as new experiences arrive. Learning, in this sense, is not a destination. It is a practice. A useful way to think about this practice is to notice what happens when you encounter something unfamiliar. Perhaps it is a new concept, a puzzling result, or an explanation that doesn't quite fit your expectations. A memorization-based approach asks, "What do I need to remember here?" A thinking-based approach asks a different question, "What is actually going on?" That question changes everything. When you ask what is going on, you begin looking for causes instead of labels, relationships instead of rules. You look for mechanisms, stories about how one thing leads to another. You try to connect the new idea to things you already understand, even if the connection is imperfect at first. This habit makes learning slower at the beginning, but far more durable in the end. Consider how you might approach a simple machine like a lever. You could memorize the rule about distances and forces, or you could imagine a long beam balanced on a point, pushing down on one end and watching the other rise. You could feel the effort in your arms. You could notice how moving the balance point changes what is easy and what is hard. The rule emerges naturally from the experience. In this way, understanding grows out of interaction, not recitation. Learning as a way of thinking also means becoming comfortable with revision. Many people believe that once they know something, it should stay fixed. But this belief turns knowledge into something fragile. The moment a contradiction appears, it feels threatening. A healthier approach treats ideas as working models. You use them because they work, not because they are sacred. When they fail, you don't defend them, you improve them. This attitude requires confidence, but not the kind that comes from certainty. It comes from trust in your ability to reason. When you trust your reasoning, you are less afraid of being wrong. Being wrong becomes informative rather than humiliating. It tells you something important about the limits of your current picture. This is how scientists think, but it is not limited to science. It applies to history, to art, to everyday decisions. Anytime you ask why things turned out the way they did or what might happen, If conditions change, you are practicing this way of thinking. Another mark of this approach is attention to language. Words are useful, but they can also mislead. When a word feels like it explains something, pause and ask whether it actually describes a process or merely names one. For example, saying that something happens because of instinct or because of intelligence may sound explanatory, but often it only shifts the mystery to a new label. A thinking learner treats such words as placeholders, not conclusions. They ask, what does that look like in action? What steps are involved? What could I observe if this explanation were true? Learning becomes an investigation rather than an acceptance. Over time, this way of thinking changes how knowledge feels. It stops feeling heavy, like a burden you must carry and protect. It becomes lighter, more flexible. You can turn ideas around, examine them from different angles, and even let them go temporarily, knowing you can reconstruct them when needed. This is one of the great pleasures of understanding. It gives you independence. You are no longer dependent on perfect memory or constant reference. You can reason your way forward even when details are missing. And perhaps the most important change is this: curiosity replaces anxiety. When learning is about memorization, forgetting feels like loss. When learning is about understanding, forgetting is an inconvenience at most. You know how to rebuild, you know how to ask questions, you know where to start. This confidence does not make you arrogant. In fact, it does the opposite. It keeps you aware of how much there is still to learn. It makes you careful with claims and generous with uncertainty. In the end, learning as a way of thinking is an invitation. It invites you to engage with the world directly, to test ideas against experience, and to remain open to surprise. You don't learn in order to arrive at certainty. You learn in order to see more clearly. And the clearer you see, the more there is to wonder about